Hello, as we begin today's lecture, I want to begin with a certain scenario. Imagine that you are home or get home and all of a sudden a letter is delivered to you or to your house. And that letter reads, you open it up and the letter reads, "Roses are red, violets are blue, and I have a crush on you." Now, there might be lots of questions going through your head as you open that letter. You might be wondering, who sent this? Maybe there's no name on it. If there's no name, maybe you're wondering, can you narrow down at least who it might be from based on the address information or post office stamps? You might want to know, is this a legit letter, or is it a gag by a friend or enemy? You might want to know if it's to you or is it to someone else, if there's no clear indication of recipient. You might want to know how this should be interpreted. Are you supposed to look for clues? Are you supposed to crumple it up and throw it in the recycling bin? Are you supposed to feel flattered? Are you supposed to feel annoyed? What is the interpretation of this message? And all these questions that are in your mind have to do with the background of that letter that you received. And these background questions are the same that scholars use to look at different parts of the Bible. And actually, historians use these of any text that they find somewhere that's an ancient text or even a more recent one. They want to look at these questions. And if you look now at your notes, I want to apply this situation I just gave, this hypothetical situation, to biblical texts, but I'll go back and forth between the example I began with and how this relates to the Bible. So, background questions and observations are related to anything that helped create a biblical text. So just like you were wondering what created this letter, why was it written, how should it be interpreted, is it an authentic crush, hint, love letter, or is it a gag? Who wrote it? Where do they live if you don't know exactly who? Is it to me or to someone else? All these questions have to do with the background that helped produce this piece of paper you're holding or produce the biblical book that you or someone else is reading. And so background questions have to do with authors and recipients of a book or a letter. It has to do with historical events and situations that caused the book or letter to be written. And this, there's a fancy German term that sometimes scholarly sources will use, and that's called the Sitz im Leben. The Sitz im Leben, and that is, it means setting in life, like the life situation. That caused something to be written. So in other words, for part of the Bible, why were the Gospels written? Well, perhaps it was because the apostles were beginning to die off, those who knew Jesus, and so the records wanted to be preserved. Why did Paul write certain of his letters? Well, perhaps there are clues that there are problems going on in the church, or he wants to prepare them for some upcoming visit from him or someone else. And so these life situation is a fancy term, or the German Sitz im Leben is a fancy term to ask, why was this written? They want to know the genre or book of a book or letter. Is it historical? Is it an allegory, meaning it's a symbolic? Is it prophecy? Is this a letter or is it a sermon? Genre has to do with a type of something. And so you might, again, be asking for the example I gave. You might be wondering, are you holding an authentic crushed letter, or is this kind of a prank or some other greater mystery? What's going on? What kind of writing is it? Your crushed love letter probably did not have multiple sources or redactors, but parts of the Bible, longer books, and like even we talked about with the Gospels, indicate that there were probably sources and material being redacted. The word redact is a fancy term for editing together. And so if you recall in quarter 2, most scholars think that the Gospels were redacted, in that Luke used Mark's Gospel sometimes, and so that he used parts of Mark and cut and pasted into his own letter, his own Gospel. He used Q, if you remember Q, these collection of sayings of Jesus, and he also used his own material called L, and so this would be a sign of redaction. Is there examples of redaction? And there are examples of redaction in the letters as well. Some of Paul's letters, especially 2 Corinthians, many scholars think is redacted because the letter has these abrupt changes and seems to indicate that perhaps as the Bible letters were collected, perhaps some of them were kind of combined as they were passed around to different churches. Finally, anything related to the general history or geography or culture of a biblical book or letter can be part of this background question. When I was at the conference I have the privilege of speaking for the Society of Biblical Literature, another student who was getting her doctorate at the University of Emory University in Georgia, she gave a presentation on inscriptions of tombs, of early Christian tombs, and she was looking at all the different symbols and texts of early Christian tombs to look for clues as to how Christians viewed death and what was the message that they tried to convey to inspire hope for those who were gone and for those who remained and would obviously miss them. And so that is not in the Bible, never mentions what they wrote on when people died, but we do have ancient tombs that date almost to biblical times, or some, it's hard to exactly know when they date back to, she was studying these to try to look for information. So you could look at lots of different things. You'd ask about what marriage was like back in New Testament times. You could look at where a city like Philippi was. You could look at just anything, again, with the history, geography, culture of that might have information for a biblical book or letter. So here are some primary questions to ask, and some of these I've already mentioned in my example of the love letter or of the Bible, but this is a good checklist, and this is related to one of the questions on your study guide. There's a little chart of the question words. So background questions that have to do with who or where have to do with the author and the recipients. And so questions include who wrote a book or a letter? To whom was a book or letter written for? And there's a fancy term for that called provenance. Sometimes Bible scholarly things will refer to the provenance and saying this seems like it was originated in Alexandria, or it seems like it was meant for the Christians in the Roman territory of Asia. Where was the author writing from? Where was the location of the recipients? Again, that has to do with that term provenance. Another question that scholars ask is when and why was the book or letter written? I'm just going to call it X. Why was it written? When was it written? We talked about the why has to do with that Sitzim Levin. Why was the book written? And the date, is there information, clues, things that the author references that could suggest when it was written? So for instance, if hundreds or thousands of years from now, people found resources, just a random text, and it mentioned the corona quarantine and being under quarantine, then perhaps with other information they could use and say this must come from the year 2020 when the coronavirus caused widespread quarantine around the world. And so these would be examples of what scholars might use. They might know when something was happening in the Roman Empire, and then if the part of the Bible alludes to that person or alludes to that event or alludes to some kind of cultural thing that they can specify, then they could say, well, it seems like the book was written somewhere between this date and that date, or in this year. For the what question, the main what question is looking at what genre. Again, a genre is a type of writing or a type of something. What genre is the book or letter, and how should that impact its interpretation? Again, going back to the example I gave with this mystery love note, if the genre is an authentic love note, then you may want to know who it is, so you may know how to respond. Will you accept their invitation or inquire further and seek to get to know them or go on a date or whatever? Or will you reject their advances? If, however, the genre of the letter you received in the mail is malicious or just meant to be a gag, then you would be silly to go around and say, oh, I wonder who wrote this, and is it this crush or that crush, or this person I know from school, or that person in my church, or whomever, that person in my neighborhood. You would be wasting your time because their point was to just be annoying or goofy or just cause you drama. So, genre affects interpretation, and that's true of the Bible as well. If we read parts of the Bible that are meant to be symbolic and we read them literally, then we run into trouble. Like, for instance, when it says that God, you are my rock. If we read that literally, then we'll worship an idol of rock. And that would be wrong. If we read parts that are meant to refer to a specific situation, but then we apply them to today in a wrong way, that sometimes happens, or there are debates about, was this written for back then, or does it still apply today, and such. And so there's lots of situations where interpretation is affected by genre, and as we look at Revelation, that's particularly true. And so again, there are some churches we'll see as we talk about application that have countdowns of the prophecies in Revelation, and they are waiting till finally they're all fulfilled, because then that means it's the end of the world. Others will say, no, that'd be a false application, because the symbolism has to do with things back then, when Bible times, and so the book still applies to us today, but not in the same way that it applied to people back then, and it's not some countdown to the end of the world. Finally, then, the how questions. How questions could be, again, how was it written? Was it written by one person or by redactors? Was it, and how, again, meaning, did one person just sit and write this, or did one person write part of it and then another person wrote another part, and those pieces were combined or edited together, or a fancy term, redacted together? And then finally, the other how question is, how does this book or letter relate to other historical, geographical, or other cultural features of its time. And again, this creates innumerable ways to study the Bible. And so questions people ask are, where is Corinth, and was Corinth like? By learning about its socioeconomics, its size, its political power, etc. That can give us a better understanding of why Paul is writing what he's writing and what it means. What was the dynamic of Greco-Roman families of this time, of Jewish families, both in Palestine and the diaspora? And so by studying families, people could look at verses of the Bible that talk about husbands and wives or parents and children, and better understand was the things that Jesus or Paul or whomever was writing. Are these things kind of countercultural, or are they more in line with what was already the norm? Another example would be, what religious background might Gentile converts have had, and how would that have affected their view of Christianity? And so there are lots of different religions at the time, and as these people became Christian, how might that affect their view of Christianity, or what kinds of influences might they bring, or how might their understanding and application of Christianity be different depending on whether they were one religion or another before they became a follower of Jesus. Some other examples of background questions might be, what do we know about Paul or Peter, whoever wrote this part of the Bible? How might that affect how we read their words and understand passages that aren't as clear? We talked about this next example last quarter, pseudonymity, meaning writing under a false name. And so wanting to understand pseudonymity in its ancient context, and why would people write in another person's name? Were they trying to trick their readers? Would their readers know it's not really them? Is there a sense that the writings have a different style or a different way to be read if they're pseudonymous? Finally, another example, and again, there's countless more, and much of what people do when they study the Bible today is study its background in different ways to try to better understand verses or chapters or whole books of the Bible or sections of the Bible. So another example might be, what was the status of women in that culture at that time? And so parts of the New Testament talk about women and their roles in church, or suggest that they aren't to have certain roles in church. And so are these verses about women, again, are they countercultural, meaning that they're giving women less or more opportunities than they would in other parts of society? Or are they kind of or are they more or less keeping in line with what was common in other religions and in other aspects of society? So again, these are just a handful of examples, but there's countless more that look at the geography, the history, the people, and the culture that was around during the time the Bible was written. For this next part, notes to be, I'm just going to give a quick summary of this. And if you are going for that high pass and you want to read the whole thing, good for you. It's all here. There's no blanks. But let's just let me just give a quick 1 minute summary of this section of our notes. So, as you perhaps could guess from these kinds of questions that could be asked, there's a lot of controversial topics related to the background of the Bible. You're asking things like, is this a historical book? Most of us, perhaps all of us, assume when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that we're reading things that really happen and they're about real people. But there's no inherent reason why that should be assumed right off the bat. Now, when you start studying the history of the Greco-Roman time, you realize it's referring to real Roman governors and rulers. But even today, there are historical fiction novels and historical fiction movies. And so how are we supposed to know that this was real and not made up? So this is really controversial. And to make matters worse, it's hard to prove who is correct. We have some evidence. Jesus, for instance, is mentioned outside of the Bible, Jesus of Nazareth, in a couple different sources. And so there's enough proof that virtually every scholar, I would argue every scholar, believes Jesus really existed, even if they don't believe he did miracles or rose from the dead. But other questions are really hard, and I give examples about the Bible and creation, or about proving whether Paul really wrote a letter or didn't write a letter. There's just not a lot of evidence that you can use to support one answer or the other. And finally, then there's a lot that's going into the importance of these background questions, because if you know when a book was written, then you know how to read it better. But if you are incorrect in your assumption, then you're actually probably reading the book wrong, in a wrong way or a less helpful way. And so these background questions are really key. They really help us interpret the words that are used, the examples that are used, and think about how that might apply to our lives today. But sometimes and often it's difficult to answer these background questions with certainty. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you want to read all of the to-be notes, good for you. And if you don't, that is okay. There's only one optional high-pass question on the study guide related to them. Finally, notes 2C and D, we'll go over those in class Tuesday and Thursday. So this will conclude our video lecture for lesson 2. Thank you.